It's now our honor to have for the closing keynote Dr. Glenda Humiston, who is the Vice President of University of California Agriculture and Natural Resources.
Well, thank you. It's been great to be here this last day or so. I really have enjoyed speakers and having a chance to visit with a few of you and listening to these reports. It's really clear that you've got some disparate disciplines coming together around some innovative ideas. And that's really what CAFE is about. This is my third CAFE event to attend. I've been a big fan of it and Norm since the very beginning. Because I think it's important. I think it's really critical that we start looking for these new solutions. So what I'd like to do for just the last few minutes before everybody goes on with the rest of their life this week is talk about some ideas to maybe hopefully pique your thinking, get it going a little bit more on scaling up and leveraging. And in particular, I love this term, unlikely allies. Because all too often we don't think about where there might be an ally out there. And it doesn't have to be a person or a group. It could be an action or an initiative that you wouldn't think of, leveraging for your own purposes. And I want to throw one of those at you today. And you're going to think I'm nuts at first, but I promise you it will work out. If this thing works out. Which one do I push? Am I pushing this right? Can you do it? Okay, you do it. That'll work fine. Just next one, please. So real quickly, just in case you aren't aware of the Ag and Natural Resources entity for the UC system, we have an extremely broad mission. In fact, it's hard for me to actually describe to people what I do, so I tell them that there's nothing I can't do, really. If you look at this mission, food system, economic success in a global economy, that kind of opens up the door to everything, really. Healthy, productive environments, and then, of course, scientific literacy, one of the key issues I'm very worried about these days, and our youth development programs. Next. So I want to show you an example of scaling up by going back to a slide that I utilized about 5 or 6 years ago. Before CAFE was started, I was coming down here a lot for Grow Riverside. Because frankly, I gotta say, you folks here, you should give yourselves a huge pat on the back. Riverside has for quite some time now really been on the cutting edge of trying to find these synergies and these collaborations and new ways to do business, particularly around a food system. And one of the things that, in addition to this, if you go to the next slide, I'd like to point out is that you're part of a broader system too, a regional system. The LA Food Policy Council, which is another entity that I love to share with people around this state and elsewhere, doing some amazing stuff. And the one thing I'd like to point out today is their Good Food Purchasing Program. And I know this is something that Riverside School District has gotten into the last year or two, but frankly, it's one of those examples of where there's so much opportunity. Actually, the last reporter got into that a little bit, the idea of using not just public institutions, but other anchor institutions to help drive behavior in markets and et cetera. And they don't have to be public. As I said, it could be private. I think we all saw how quickly some huge change is happening in the ag sector around animal production when McDonald's and companies like it start saying they want meat that hasn't been raised with antibiotics. People have been trying to get antibiotics out of the meat production system for decades. McDonald's says that, and all of a sudden everybody's changing production practices. It's the power of that huge anchor institution. So this is something that I think is worth looking at, is how can some of the items you all are working on, where else in your county, your region, or elsewhere, might there be somebody that could be an ally, could be a partner on that? Next. And then let me take you into an even bigger region. So this is an effort that was approved by the White House a few years ago, one of several nationally, one of only 2 around food, from the communities manufacturing partnerships, communities of manufacturing partnership. It's 28 counties, and what it's looking at is really trying to find that synergy around food and beverage manufacturing. And what I love about this is it's one of the first times, particularly at this scale, I've seen the workforce people, the research people, the infrastructure, the finance, the manufacturing, the food system, the farmers, all of them coming to the table and talking together about how to make the system work. All too often, the people that are working on infrastructure, they don't even have a clue what's being talked about in the research field. And the researchers don't necessarily know what the finance folks are looking for. They talk different jargon, different languages. It's been amazing to see what's happening with this. They've had a lot of successes the last couple of years, and they're getting more and more partners working all the time. It's a great example that could be done elsewhere geographically. It also could be done elsewhere in other industry sectors. In fact, I'm going to show you an example of that in just a second. So related to that, and pardon me, I'm sucking on a cough drop so I get through this talk without coughing. Related to that, another big issue out there this year in particular, and again, this has been bubbling for many, many years, is this concept of ecosystem services. It's been out there for at least a couple decades. I can recall when I started my PhD dissertation, I was looking at the European multifunctionality as a potential example of a new framework for US farm policy. Because right now, our farm policy is giving out these subsidies to farmers, and it's based on cropping. What if US farm policy was based on ecosystem services? And there's plenty of interest groups wanting to do that. It's never quite caught on. I keep hoping one of these days it's going to. But we don't have to wait for the Farm Bill. Here in California, you can expect to see some legislation enacting some of the recommendations in this report this year. Senator McGuire has been meeting with the people that worked on this report, which was released just a year and a half ago. This is something we worked on very closely with the State Economic Summit. A lot of research came into several bits of recommendation. And what they're going to do is Senator McGuire is going to be putting in legislation that will create funding and the authorization for three pilot projects. One of them will be down here. It'll probably be the Santa Ana watershed, the Russian River watershed, and then we're still discussing which one in the San Joaquin Valley. But what we're doing is taking watersheds that have done some really interesting work around ecosystem services in different ways and trying to ratchet that up, gather what lessons can be learned and turn it into policy that can then be statewide. It's a great approach. I think as we're looking at the food system, this concept of ecosystem services is really, really critical and one that we all need to do, and it's something that could even be done at the local level. And it gets into, there's 17 different types of ecosystem services recognized by the Millennium Assessment. It gets into things like, reducing flooding. One of the things we're particularly excited about here in California, dealing with water issues, is to try to facilitate groundwater recharge by flooding farm fields during the winter. There's been a great deal of research on that going on up in the San Joaquin Valley, but there's places down here in this region too, all over the state, which are very appropriate for that type of approach. It's a very innovative approach, and what we're finding out through our research is that quite a few tree and vine crops don't mind having a little water. Vines actually, when they're in their dormant stage, they can be practically underwater for 2 or 3 weeks. It doesn't harm them. And we're finding out almond trees don't mind it too much either for a while. Now some trees do, and that's part of the research. What can work and what can't? How do we facilitate it? Where are the best landscapes in California to do it? Some mapping exercises that we're doing, geology, geomorphology, et cetera. Again, a lot of different disciplines coming together on this. And then, of course, the lawyers will have to get involved because there is nothing more complex in the world than water law, particularly in California. Water law, hundreds of small local water districts, local government, state government. It's going to be really fascinating to see how to implement some of this. But the good news is there's really some exciting things happening. Next. Which brings me to something else. Now this is where I'm going to start veering into an area that you're going to say, well, what exactly does this have to do with food? But bear with me for a couple slides. So just this past year, as part of the State Economic Summit, we kicked off something that we're calling Elevate Rural California. This has been several years evolving towards this. I went to the very first State Economic Summit in 2012, held in San Jose. I was there because at the time I was working on access to capital, particularly in rural areas. It was a huge, the Great Recession was a huge problem. And while I was there, myself and several other people got extremely frustrated. We were there all day long, 500 people from throughout California talking about how do we make California's economy healthy. And at the end of the day, I swear to God, you would have thought the California economy was existing on a barren asteroid in outer space. There was no discussion of soil, natural resources, agriculture, tiniest, just a bit of a moment on water and only about how the cities might use it better. I mean, it was unbelievable. So myself and several other people spent the next year fighting to get officially chartered a working landscapes action team, which I co-chair with A.G. Kawamura, who's next door to you over here in Orange County. We've worked on several things, including like that ecosystem services and other projects. The groundwater recharge is part of that. But this is more of a thing to deal with the last couple of years' discussion about two Californias. We've got our rich coastal areas, we've got our fairly poor interior areas. And after a great deal of work, we've zeroed in on these three items that we're going to be focusing on this year. Obviously, water infrastructure is critical. Broadband connectivity is more critical to the ag than you might think. A lot of the efforts we're trying to do out there to improve things like reducing use of water, reducing use of nitrogen and fertilizers, improving pest management without using chemicals, requires a lot of sensors and satellite imagery, in-soil sensors. And guess what? If you're going to make use of that data, it's got to get from the ground to you, to your computer. And one of the big issues you run into in rural California, very quickly, A, big chunks of it don't even have good access to the internet, and B, you run into bandwidth problems very quickly. Imagine every single tree in the San Joaquin Valley with its own little sensor on it. And that's what some farmers up there are doing. Big bandwidth problems. But the one I'm going to focus on is actually the top one there, biomass development. And in particular, I'm going to focus for just a moment on the forest aspects of that. It's a huge issue, both workforce, economic development, and right now, because of all the fire issues, people are really wound up about fire. You've probably noticed that since our new governor, Gavin Newsom, has come on, he's been really focusing appointments, funding, a lot of initiative, effort, and focus on fire. In fact, there's a brand new fire solutions group that's been meeting for the last 2 or 3 weeks. I've been on those phone calls. So if you go to the next slide, related to that, this is kind of the topic that we've been working on the last just literally 5 or 6 months, trying to find a solution to biomass issues in the forest. And one of the things we're trying to do is find a solution that really is viable, a triple bottom line solution. Good for the environment, good for people, prosperity, and also feasible. This is an effort we're talking about to actually get biomass into economically viable uses, which, by the way, doesn't really include burning it up for electricity, which is what everybody wants to do. That just doesn't pencil out. And although there's a lot of people out there that just adore biochar, and I think biochar is an amazing thing. You put it in the ground, it does help sequester carbon. Our research has been showing us that for a decade now. We know it's great in the ground. It's not economically viable to actually get it out there and spread it out over thousands of acres in any meaningful way. That's the big challenge for biochar. So what are we going to do? Where are we going to have a home for all of this biomass that we need to find a home for other than burning it up? Advanced wood products, bioplastics, cellulosic nanofibers, etc. Can you give me the next slide? So what we're proposing and working on right now is actually going out there and building the entire supply chain. And believe me, we've got this. Comes out of legislation, SB 859, from last legislative cycle. Funding for it. There's funding and legislation to stand up a Wood Products Innovation Institute that UC, CSU, and the Board of Forestry are jointly standing up. There's teams looking at building codes for buildings, regulatory issues, how this would work, and pushing forward on it quickly. And the governor and his new appointees and new folks are really pushing on this. And what makes it work is this idea that up in the Sierra or the Cascade or down here in these forests, you have these very early stage pre-processing facilities. So you get that biomass without having to haul it more than about 40 miles. 40 to 45 miles is about as far as you can haul biomass and make it economically viable. You do that pre-processing because when you talk about things like cellulosic nanofibers or bioplastics or CLT or any of the advanced wood products, they're a manufacturing stage that might be 20 to 30 stages, right? But the first 3 or 4 are pretty much the same stage. It's that initial breaking it down into the cellulose so that it can be used for other things. If we can do that up in the forest on existing industrial sites, there are literally dozens of existing abandoned or underutilized sites, old mills, old sawmills, old biomass plants up there. So you're talking about existing sites on roads, use them, do that pre-processing, get that feedstock down into the valley where you've got your goods movement. You've got highways and railroads and the Port of Stockton and elsewhere. Do the manufacturing. And the good news is we've got at least 2 entities in this state that want to do manufacturing. And then have your public institutions as the market. Washington State has already enacted that legislation. They're requiring it. It was strongly encouraged last year in SB 859, but I'm being told right now it's probably going to be enacted as a requirement. UC, CSU, public institutions required to buy these materials. And the good thing is they're gorgeous. That building there in the bottom, that's at the, I believe that one's up at University of British Columbia. Canada has been doing this for decades, as has Europe. Washington State and Oregon are on board with it now. California is actually doing a little catch-up. Portland, Oregon is building a building out of wood right now, 14 stories tall. It's better in a fire, it's better in an earthquake, it's more energy efficient, and you're sequestering carbon to the tune of taking thousands of cars off the road each building. It's a win-win-win for everybody. So this is what we're looking at. How do we facilitate this? This also helps UC get to their goal of being carbon neutral in 2025. Because right now, we've harvested a lot of the low-hanging fruit on carbon neutrality. That last little bit is going to be really, really difficult if we don't start doing some really big, ambitious efforts like this. Next slide. Next slide. So I've just talked about UC as a system driver for this. So why do you guys care about any of this? I mean, this is forest issues, right? Agriculture has a huge amount of biomass. When we pull those trees out, the almond trees, we pull those vineyards out, walnut shells, tons of biomass. And quite frankly, it also doesn't have a good home. But it's so dispersed, and it just, thus far we have not been able to find very good, economically viable solutions to that biomass. If we put the infrastructure in place to deal with the forests, we're going to then be able to make that available to agricultural biomass. They'll be able to leverage it. And in the long run, when we can start turning things like biomass, waste from agricultural activities, currently called waste, into something that could be a profit center, that's going to enable farmers to have a little bit more margin, a little bit more leeway with their production activities to make that move into organic and sustainable and more environmentally efficient, and reducing some of the things they do right now largely due to cost factors that are pushing them. So I'm pretty excited about this. I think it isn't going to happen overnight. We all know that. But there is some really, really good momentum on it that is, I would hope some of you would get interested in, because this is something that is a huge factor statewide. One of the issues we're going to be dealing with initially is just getting the general public to understand the opportunity and also to understand what's involved in biomass related to forest health. We've already had people pop up and scream and yell, you can't do this because you can't touch a single tree out there in those forests. They feel like when we're trying to deal with, and we're not talking big giant trees, we're talking the small stuff. We're talking invasive species in many cases in our forests, overgrown forests, getting that out in a feasible way and in a sustainable way too. But it's going to take some education, but if we can do it, it's going to reduce fire. It's going to actually produce more water for the state. We've got research from UC Davis, Berkeley, Merced, all showing, and Lawrence Livermore National Lab, that healthy forested watersheds in the Sierra could produce anywhere from 9 to 15% more water. And a big chunk of the water in this state comes out of those forested watersheds. There'll be better wildlife habitat if we can get them back to a more natural state. And by the way, there'll be better recreation opportunities for us. The processing up in the hills, jobs, economic development in communities that are really, really hurting, and improving some opportunities for ag. Plus then better buildings here too. And by the way, these buildings are gorgeous. So to me, it's like the ultimate win-win-win. But we got to have it's got a lot of moving pieces. It's going to have a lot of policy challenges. It still needs a lot of research on these products, how to use them, how best to distribute them, haul them. There's so much research on this still left to be done, as well as just the economics and policy angles. But one of the things, and this is, I think, is my last slide, is just the challenges we're facing. The challenges we're facing to be able to actually do that research and make this happen. Up here, I'm showing you one of the challenges with just federal funding. We've been consistently losing funding on agricultural and natural resources research in state funding for a couple decades now. You know, one of the key jewels of the UC system as a land grant, sorry, I'm getting over a cold from last week. One of the key things in our land grant system is our cooperative extension and our ag experiment station. Right now today, we have about half the cooperative extension advisors and specialists in California that we had 20 years ago. And what that means is that we're not able to get the resources, the research, the knowledge, the technology from our campuses, from UC, out into the field the way we could and should. We also are not delivering to those folks in the 48 counties that don't have a campus, UC, to the point that they want to go to the legislature and say, hey, give UC money. That's been one of the grand bargains for land grants for almost a century and a half now, is that they were the public institutions serving the average person in the field who then would support them. We've got to turn that around. And the good news is we've got a lot of stakeholders doing that. We've got studies showing the return on investment. We've got organizations such as the ones that SOAR that put this report out coming together, very disparate organizations. So there's a lot going on. It's pretty exciting. I'm really thrilled to be working with it. And you guys here at Cafe, you are right along this line. I loved yesterday and today hearing the word multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary. It felt like almost every other sentence. A lot of your speakers said it, a lot of them today too. That's really where it's going to get us these solutions and help us move forward. The multidisciplinary focus on finding the solutions, the collaborative focus on getting disparate entities, unlikely allies to work together on them, and then finally, the alliances we can build to try to get the funding and the policy and the support from the public, the urban and rural public, to move these forward. So with that, I want to thank you, and Norm, especially you for your leadership, but all your folks here for taking the time to work on these. It's exactly these kind of conferences and your work that helps move these items forward. So thank you.